Tonight, Donald Trump takes aim at Canada again, this time on the world stage.
We don't need them to make our cars. We don't need their lumber. We don't need their oil and gas.
There won't be one ounce of energy coming from Ontario.
I want to help the Americans get global energy dominance because they cannot do it without us. They produce 13 million barrels a day of oil. They consume 19 million barrels a day.
Something significant is shifting between Washington and Ottawa, and few are paying attention. Earlier this year, the United States placed a sweeping 25% EHINJ and tariff on nearly all Canadian exports: cars, metals, food, machinery, everything except oil. Alberta's crude was hit with only 10%. On the surface, it looked like a calculated trade maneuver. Beneath it, the move exposed one of America's most fragile dependencies. The truth is that the U.S. can't afford to turn against the very neighbor fueling its economic engine, because when it comes to energy, Canada isn't just another trading partner. It's the lifeline keeping America's refineries alive. Canada ranks as the fourth largest oil and gas producer on the planet, and 97% of its energy exports flow south across the border. That trade link isn't one-sided, though. The United States relies heavily on Canadian energy to keep its refineries and industries running. Around 60% of the oil and gas feeding into the American market comes directly from Canada. Despite being one of the world's biggest oil producers, pumping about 13 million barrels per day, the U.S. consumes around 19 million. The gap between those numbers tells a story of deep dependence, one that often gets buried under political slogans about energy independence. In raw figures, over 62% of America's imported oil originates in Canada. And in the country's industrial heartland, the Midwest, nearly 3/4 of the crude refined each day is Canadian. Refineries in that region weren't simply connected to Alberta's oil sands, they were built around them. Decades of infrastructure were designed for one specific type of heavy, sulfur-rich crude that few other producers can supply in such volume or consistency. If that steady flow were disrupted, large parts of America's energy network would slow or even shut down, sending shockwaves through the entire economy. That's what makes Washington's selective tariffs so telling. The government walled off nearly every Canadian product except the one resource that keeps American refineries from grinding to a halt. And beneath that decision lies a quiet acknowledgement. Canada's oil is the thread holding together much of the U.S. industrial landscape. What many outside the energy world overlook is how tightly the two economies are locked together through engineering itself. Most American refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, classified under Petroleum Administration Districts 2 and 3, were custom designed to process Alberta's dense crude. Engineers describe these facilities as hardwired, meaning they can't easily switch to lighter oil from Texas, the Middle East, or anywhere else without immense modification costs. Reconfiguring them would take years and billions of dollars, and even then, efficiency would plummet. One analyst summed it up bluntly: without Canada, the U.S. couldn't even operate its own refineries. While Washington tries to project control, Canada has been quietly building leverage of its own. In May 2024, the long-delayed Trans Mountain Expansion project finally became operational. The new pipeline increased capacity to 890,000 barrels per day, nearly triple what it once carried. For the first time in history, Canadian oil could reach international markets without passing through the United States. Tankers now depart directly from the Pacific coast, sending Alberta's crude across the ocean instead of south across the border. By the middle of 2025, exports outside the U.S. had reached around 400,000 barrels per day, a massive rise from roughly 80,000 just a year earlier. Among the new buyers, China emerged as the largest, rapidly becoming one of Canada's most valuable customers. This shift wasn't simply about selling more oil, it was about rewriting the geography of global supply. Each barrel now flowing west, instead of south, represents a small but decisive realignment of power. Proof that Alberta no longer exists solely to serve America's needs. And here lies a striking paradox. Every tariff that Washington imposes on Canadian goods ultimately ends up circling back to hit its own economy. Economists have begun calling it the mirror wall, a policy boomerang where every action has an equal and opposite consequence. Energy experts refer to this situation as a self-imposed constraint, a system that traps the U.S. within its own trade architecture. Even the electricity grid reflects this dependence. Each year, the U.S. imports about 33 terawatt-hours of power from Canada, a crucial contribution to industries that rely on constant, affordable energy, defense manufacturing, AI computing, and heavy production. Any interruption in that flow wouldn't stay isolated to energy markets. It would ripple across state economies, cutting into factory output and jobs. In industrial hubs like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, where manufacturing plants depend on stable energy from the north, tariffs meant to protect American labor could easily end up harming it. The more Washington tightens its trade barriers, the more it risks cornering itself within a feedback loop of rising prices and lost competitiveness. Meanwhile, Ottawa has been playing a very different game, one grounded not in retaliation, but in adaptability. Prime Minister Mark Carney's administration has framed this period as the end of one-way energy dependence. Canada, he argues, can simultaneously lead as an oil producer and as a pioneer in clean technology. Rather than viewing energy as a weapon or vulnerability, the government is treating it as a form of diplomacy. Under a new tiered engagement framework, Canada is deepening partnerships across Asia, focusing on both energy and digital infrastructure. This strategy isn't about taking sides. It's about making Canada too valuable for anyone to ignore. The Trans Mountain expansion sits at the center of that plan. By providing access to Pacific trade routes, it has narrowed the price gap between Western Canadian Select, WCS, and West Texas Intermediate, WTI, allowing Canadian producers like Suncor and Cenovus to earn billions more in export revenue. That additional income isn't simply padding corporate profits, it's feeding directly into a broader national vision known as the Made in Canada Energy Corridor. This initiative links traditional oil and gas production with new projects in green hydrogen and clean energy innovation. Each shipment of crude now carries more than market value. It carries strategic leverage. Canada is shifting from being a supplier dictated by American demand to a global actor negotiating from strength. While the United States turns inward, building walls of tariffs and trade restrictions, global investors are increasingly looking northward to a country offering reliability and balance. In uncertain times, that steadiness has become Canada's greatest asset. Analysts describe it as a stability buffer within the global energy map, a counterweight to volatility elsewhere. Buyers are choosing Canada not because it's the cheapest supplier, but because it's consistent, transparent, and dependable. Even major international metrics back that perception. The OECD's Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index places Canada's energy sector at 0.20, fully open and transparent by G7 standards. That level of openness reduces risk for foreign investors, encouraging long-term partnerships that outlast political cycles. Japan, South Korea, and Germany are now locking in multi-decade contracts with Canadian energy firms, betting on stability in a world increasingly defined by unpredictability. Across North America, the balance of influence is shifting. The continent's energy map is no longer being shaped solely in Washington, but by the rising partnership between Ottawa and Alberta. A partnership that's blending resources, innovation, and diplomacy into a new economic force. Each time the U.S. tightens a tariff, it inadvertently strengthens Canada's hand. Every barrier meant to constrain trade pushes more markets toward Canadian supply. What once looked like dependence has evolved into interdependence, and within that relationship, the quieter partner now holds the leverage. This reversal isn't fueled by aggression, but by patience. Each policy misstep from Washington bends the system further in Canada's favor, granting it greater influence over the flow of North American energy. Analysts warn that if this pattern continues, the U.S. may lose strategic control over the very network it spent decades building. The structure remains American in origin, but the management of its lifeblood, energy, is increasingly Canadian. Because today, Canada isn't simply exporting oil, it's exporting confidence. In a global economy running low on trust, that has become the rarest and most valuable resource of all. During a nearly 3-hour hearing, the government's top lawyer, Solicitor General D. John Sauer, defended Trump's actions, citing a 1977 law known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. This legislation gives presidents certain powers to regulate trade during declared national emergencies that originate outside U.S. borders and threaten national security or the economy. Trump invoked that law in February, arguing that foreign nations were fueling the flow of drugs like fentanyl into the United States, and that this constituted an extraordinary threat. He used the same reasoning to levy a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico, and a 10% tariff on Chinese goods, later adjusting the rates after meetings with foreign leaders. Throughout the hearing, the justices questioned both sides sharply. Chief Justice John Roberts pointed out that the IEPA statute never mentions tariffs and questioned whether the administration had stretched the law beyond its intent. Justice Elena Kagan added that while IEPA allows many executive actions, tariffs were not among them. Even Justice Amy Coney Barrett, one of Trump's own appointees, expressed doubt, pressing the administration's lawyer to explain why such a wide range of countries, from China to Spain, were targeted under the same emergency justification. Sauer responded that the lack of reciprocity in global trade created a universal threat to U.S. economic stability, a statement that appeared to leave some judges unconvinced. Justice Sonia Sotomayor was more direct, telling Sauer that his claim that tariffs were not taxes contradicted basic economic reality. Government data supports her skepticism. By late August, Trump's tariffs under IEPA had already generated around $89 billion in revenue for the U.S. Treasury, proving their tax-like effect. Chief Justice Roberts hinted that the court might invoke the major questions doctrine, which restricts executive agencies from implementing major policies without explicit authorization from Congress. This same doctrine had previously been used to block President Joe Biden's student loan forgiveness plan, suggesting that the court may apply similar limits to Trump's trade powers. Sauer countered that such an interpretation could undermine the president's constitutional authority in foreign policy, but the panel's tone suggested that the court was weighing serious boundaries on unilateral executive action. The global implications could be even more far-reaching.